Well, the first tool, of course, is you, and is having parents with young children around to continually ask that question and raise that up in front of us so that we do deal with it. I don't think anyone's opposed to daycare. I think we just forget. And so when we have people around who are constantly raising up that question, we get better about saying, oh, yeah, we need to have daycare for that event. So I think that's an excellent one. I also think that continually being in dialogue about it is good. I was the rector of a large parish that was pretty militantly inclusive of all the children all the time. And some of the elderly women kept coming to me saying, can't you tell those parents to keep those children quiet? And I always said, no, I'm not going to tell the parents to keep those children quiet. I'm glad they're here. If they're noisy where you are, sit somewhere else. Well, you know what that does. I mean, I've been sitting in this pew for 80 years, and I'm not moving. So, and all the time I was rector, that was my militant stance, that the children could be anywhere, and if they made noise, we just had to live with it. And after I'd been gone a couple of years, there was a baptism that the rector had given me permission to come back. It was on Easter, and I was sitting in the back of the church where all the people were that were complaining about I couldn't hear anything in that service. All I could hear were all the kids running in and out and thinking, why don't those parents get to make those kids be quiet? But the wisdom of the rector that was there after I was, when things really got kind of ouchy, was he got everybody to sit down together and sort of talked with children about holy space and how we treat this space differently than you treat the backyard at home, and but not in a heavy-handed way, and not in a way that's going to make parents feel like, oh my gosh, if my child makes any noise at all, I'm going to be run out of the church. So conversation, I think, is the way to maintain a happy congregation and meet the needs from both sides. So thank you for that.
Back to the question. Would you repeat that question?
Well, I was having trouble hearing it too. I think the question is, how do we over the next 10 or 20 years know which part of our rich tradition we need to keep at all costs, and which parts of it can we be flexible about in order to draw in the unchurched? Is that a fair? Okay. Obviously, I don't have a definitive answer to that, because I think the answer comes by discerning what God's calling us to do. And I think that we only do that in community, after we have built good relationships and listened deeply to one another, listened to the stories of the people who are already here about what changed your life in the Episcopal Church. Why are you here? What's important to you about the worship and our life together, so that we can hear God speaking through that, but at the same time know that if we maintain a church only for the people who are already here, then we're simply not the church anymore. We've been called to reach out to people outside of ourselves. We've been called to change the world, not just to change the life of the people who are already here. So we've got to be able to do both and. I think for at least my generation, for as long as I can remember, we have acted as though the only way to attach to the Episcopal Church is through Sunday morning worship. And while Sunday morning worship is very important, and we hope everyone gets there eventually, we also know that particularly for teenagers, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, they don't really want to come to Sunday worship. Part of it is because some of the tradition they don't find meaningful, so they're not there. We don't have to tailor everything to everyone. We cannot. But I think if we are meeting the needs of the world, if we're building habitat houses, if we're reaching out to provide for the needs of the poor, if we're changing the lives of people in our community, young people want to come do that with us. And there isn't any reason that participating in the outreach that we're doing isn't another door into the church for young people. It doesn't just have to be come learn the hymns first and then we'll talk. There are unchurched people all over who want to learn about our spirituality. And you can teach classes on spirituality at the library or at the health club. I have a colleague in the diocese where I serve who, as soon as people at his gym figured out he was a priest, started asking him all kinds of questions. So he has a class where you can ask him whatever you want to ask him. He gets 25, 30 people there, all of whom are unchurched, who have questions about Scripture, they have questions about spirituality. He teaches them how to pray. He teaches them how to connect with God through meditation. And I think in the few years he's been doing that, maybe one person has started coming to church. But the point is, people outside are learning to pray. They're learning to invite God into their lives. So there are a lot of ways we can reach people outside the doors of the church, besides just how do we do worship that's going to bring them in. As they come in, they will have ideas about how they may want to change worship. And we do have to be able to at least engage about that, and I think be open to things that are still in our tradition and connect with folks who are there, but also broadening the resources available to us in terms of doing liturgy so that it does become more meaningful to a broader range of people. I was delighted with the canonical changes that were done at the General Convention in, I think, 2006, where they really broadened the ability of the bishop to ordain people without 3 years of seminary education. And particularly to do that in areas where there is a need for ordained ministry that isn't being met. And I embrace that wholeheartedly. In the diocese I serve now is the size of a postage stamp. And so for a lot of years, they have heard from me about the shared ministry going on in Nebraska. They're pretty tired of that, I think. But it makes sense to me in Nebraska that we really need to expand our definition of ordained ministry and make it easier to fill those roles, so that everyone can have the Eucharist and the sacraments available to them on a regular basis. Exactly how that's going to happen, I don't think I know yet because I'm not here. And I think, again, I would only be able to discern that by being here and listening to what's being done. I do pretty much know what's been going on around the country in that area and where it's been successful and where it hasn't been successful. So I think we can avoid some of the pitfalls that have happened. But I certainly embrace the ministry of all the baptized and having sacramental ministry available in all the parts of our church. I am first and foremost an Episcopalian, and I follow the canons, and I pay attention to the resolutions of General Convention and certainly the canonical changes that happen there. So I would support implementing those changes within the diocese. I would want to do it as a passionate reconciler. I want us to build the relationships that will allow us to have the conversations across the division that exists between people who think that's a good idea and people who think that's not a good idea. There's a bridge in Japan, and I'm pretty sure it's still standing. And if I'm going to keep telling this story, I need to find that out. But there was a bridge that was constructed across the mouth of a river that is 4 miles long end to end. And it connects 2 parts of land that until that bridge existed, people had to drive hundreds of miles to make that 4-mile stretch. It was an engineering marvel, and it took 30 years to figure out the engineering of that bridge because at the mouth of this swiftly flowing river, the silt was so deep at the bottom that they couldn't really put pylons down into bedrock. And the tide, it was near where the tides would change. So it was a swift current one direction part of the day and a swift current the other direction the other part of the day. And they couldn't figure out how they'd ever have a bridge that you could maintain between these 2 points of land. And then engineers engineered more flexible steel so that with the wind and with the movement of the waves, the steel wasn't going to fail. It could flex with it. But the big thing was that current. And so they figured out they could build these big pontoons that the pylons would sit on. And that would hold up the center parts of the bridge. Well, they tested it, and what they found out is that the water would hit the pontoons and dig the sand out under the pontoons, and then the pontoons would fail, and then the pylons would fail. So that wasn't going to work. And then someone had the great idea that they would build a barrier in front of the pontoon so the water wouldn't hit the pontoon and it would all be sound. And when they built a prototype and tried it out, the water hit the barrier and it dug out the sand underneath the barrier. And then the barrier would fail and then the pontoon would. Then someone came up with the idea that they didn't need to stop the current from hitting the pylon. They only needed to slow it down. So they built sort of a system of barriers that didn't try to stop the current, but it deflected it and it slowed it down. And so when we have these conversations that are going to be really difficult, we have to be bridge builders with one another. We have to stay in conversation with the people that we disagree with. We have to learn more about what they're really saying and why they're saying it, and listen deeply to what's going on with them. And we don't have to stop anything, but we do have to slow down some of the destructive forces that are going on. I think that I know people on either ends of the spectrum on the debate about same-sex marriage that behave in ways that only make the conflict worse. And without trying to make everybody be of one mind, because I don't know a time in Scripture that that's ever happened or in human history, we can build the bridges that keep us together and keep us talking to one another if we can just keep turning down the temperature on the conflict and have respectful conversations about it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that it's a critical thing about leadership in the church today, that we have to be willing to do that. The bishop that I work for is a passionate moderate, and what that means is most people on both sides of most issues are mad at him most of the time because they can't, and I am not as moderate as he is. I'm not claiming that, but I've learned a great deal from him about standing in the middle of that, trying to stay connected with both extremes and with people on every side of an issue while we try to work that out together. I think the question was, what's the role of the bishop in the finances of the diocese? I think that the bishop always should be the chief steward in the diocese, and part of the health of the diocese is knowing that the way we deal with our finances is healthy, it's transparent, people know where the money's going and where the money's coming from, and that it's not a big secret smoke and mirrors kind of thing. I think we have to be fiscally responsible if we're going to be trusted, if we trust one another. So I am not intending to be the financial officer, but I think anyone as bishop has to stay up on what's going on with the finances, or the wheels can really come off the bus and the bishop not know about it. The diocese in which I serve, the bishop was elected there 16 years ago or 15 years ago. His predecessor had died in office, so for a couple of years they had not had a bishop, and things had really gotten pretty crazy with the finances in our office. So I know how long it took to clean that up. And I know it took a lot of the bishop's energy the first couple of years he was in office. So I think it is important that bishops stay on top of that. I think it's important that bishops can articulate to the whole diocese a narrative budget. So everybody knows why we're spending the money that we're spending. By saying, here's the mission that God's called us to do, and here's what it costs to do the different parts of that mission. So that it's not just a page full of numbers that people look at council, but they have a sense of the kind of ministry that money's empowering. Well, I'm already missing it because I do miss being a parish priest, and I haven't been a parish priest for the last 11 years. As a canon to the ordinary, however, there have been, over the last 11 years, there have been 3 or 4 parishes that hadn't been able to find interims. So I could say, well, darn, we can't find an interim for you. How about if I come do all the services and we'll get somebody else to cover the pastoral things during the week? And so I kind of get my fix of parish ministry in short bursts from time to time. And I know as bishop, you do get even further away from that. So I know that'll be a sadness for me. You probably heard me say this morning, the other thing coming onto the bishop's staff is I quickly realized it felt like I wasn't doing any real ministry. I wasn't and I do think the work I do is real ministry, but I wasn't doing ministry with people with great need. And so I started volunteering at a center for teenage homeless mothers, and that got me in connection with folks that I could be connected to and be engaged with and help. So those are the kinds of things that I know as if I'm elected bishop, I'll get to do even less, and I know I will miss those things. Thank you. It is a top priority. Oh, the question was how high a priority is developing communications around the diocese? Is that a fair paraphrase? To reach the diocese with multiple methods of communication. I think it's essential. I think that building relationships among the people of the diocese, not just with the bishop, but with one another, is essential if we are to discern where God's calling us to go. I think we can only do that by listening deeply to each other. I'm not a big top-down. If you're expecting the bishop to come in and say, here's the vision, here's where we're going, come on, that's not me. But I am someone who will come in and listen one-on-one and listen in groups, and through that listening, discern what I think God is calling us to do. But if we don't develop networks of communication that are effective, we'll never have the kind of communication and the kind of relationships that we need to have to be serious about discernment. And you can't get serious about doing God's work and doing mission as a diocese and as a body if you're not a body and if you don't have those connections. So I would try to develop layers of networks. I know the Daughters of the King are connected all across the diocese. There are other networks of people who get together. When I was a kid growing up, we lived for summer camp. I mean, we lived all year to get together for that week. And we not only knew each other, I think the junior high age kids, and in those days they were junior highs and not middle schools, we knew more about what was going on in every parish in the diocese than most of the adults did, because we had friends all over the place. And we need to replicate some of those networks to be able to learn from one another. We have discovered, I guess I should say, in my diocese, and there's a national institute that helps disseminate this idea, that parishes learn best from one another, not from an outside expert. And the second thing we learned is that parishes don't want to learn from one another. So you have to really find a way to get people to come together. But once they do that a time or two, and once they start hearing about what's going on, in another part of the diocese, they keep coming. We started a diocesan leadership development day. We started having it probably 12, 13 years ago. And the first year we had about 30 people and thought, this is a whole lot of work for only 30 people. The next year there were 75 people. The next year there were 150. And now we consistently have about 300 people come together on that day. Not because they're dying to hear whoever's doing the plenary, quite frankly. And all of the evaluations that come back say, we always say, what did you learn today that you'll implement in your parish? And 80% of the people say that the most important thing they learned from somebody that they were sitting by at lunch or sitting by in a workshop, not from the speakers. So in terms of doing those kinds of development things, I think getting people together and loosening them up. It's easier to loosen up Nebraskans, let me tell you, than it is to loosen up people in New England. Now, whoever's editing this video, I don't want to see that on the web. But in fact, it is true that the very reticent nature of New Englanders, they don't connect as readily as you do. We've also developed a method of doing Bible study. Well, we didn't develop it. Church Innovations in Minneapolis developed it. It is much like the gospel-based discipleship that some of you have probably used. It's called Dwelling in the Word. And in a group like this, we would take a passage of Scripture and read it, and then we would say to you, go find a reasonably friendly-looking stranger. And then share with that stranger how you heard God speaking to you through this passage of Scripture today. And everybody kind of giggle and be a little uncomfortable, but they would go find someone they'd never met before, and they would start sharing how the Scripture touched them. And that usually involves sharing something about what's going on in their lives. And it becomes very hard to get people back together once you start doing that. When you get back in the large group, the rule is you can't say what you think the Scripture is about. You can only share what the person you were listening to said. And one of the phrases that's used is you listen people into their truth. You listen to people deeply enough, they start telling you their deepest truth and tell you their deepest feelings. And it really it not only helps us connect to Scripture, but it really helps us to begin to connect with other people from different congregations. Well, one of the ways, one metaphor for that is the bishop. Did you all hear Tom's question? I'm sorry. I'm supposed to repeat the question, but is that the bishop becomes something like the bumblebee that's going around during visitations and traveling all over the diocese and needs to be telling the stories from one part of the diocese and one congregation to the next, so that when someone, just as you do as individuals, if someone is celebrating, we should all be celebrating with them. If someone is challenged or hurting, we should all be hurting with them. And just because they're a long way away within the diocese, there's no reason in this day and age that wouldn't connect. And so I hope that the communications methods that we develop, again, not just develop one way of communicating, but have an excellent website, have excellent email communications through, I don't know what system you use. We've used Constant Contact, which isn't rocket science, but it works. And it's pretty easy for people to do, and it's colorful. There are lots of ways so that people get communication from the diocesan office. You can set up all kinds of chat rooms and groups that people can start connecting with. In our diocese, the wardens have a chat room. They can all talk to one another all the time if they want to. The bishop meets with the wardens a couple times a year. The bishop meets with vestries at the Leadership Development Day and meets with vestries individually as he does his visitation, and that seems to work. And it gives people, when they do get together at our diocesan convention, they already have things to talk about because they've read on the website that you put in a fabulous new baptismal pool, and how's that working? And tell me the stories about the baptisms that happen there. And gosh, I heard you put in a prayer garden. Tell me the stories about people using that prayer garden and how lives are being changed because people are doing that. Stories are what transform us, and stories are what connects us in the present day, I think, to our scriptural mandates.
Thank you.